Okay, our learning is Leila Nishmas Mendel Mariam Bas Kamen Ruvin and Hashem Shem Aliyah, and we should hear B'sira Sovos across the board. It's Hashem. Okay, we're on Kuf Amud Aleph, and we've been discussing these pits, which are slightly adjusting their sizes. So we're up to Amar Abaye, about like 7 lines down or so, and 100A1 on the second column. Amar Abaye, Bar B'shus Harabim, Amuka Asar U'Rachava Shmono. So you have a pit in the public domain, which is 10 tefachim deep, and it's 8 tefachim wide. V'zark l'socha machzelet, and a person throws a mat into it. Chayiv, you're chayiv. Why? Because the pit is a private domain, and you're throwing something from a public domain. You're throwing the pit itself, because it has the right dimensions of private domain. You're throwing this mat into the pit, and therefore you're throwing from a public domain into a private domain. However, chilka b'machzeles, if the person puts the mat in a way that it bisects the pit. So you have this pit which is 8 tefachim wide, 10 tefachim deep, and then you put the mat in between. So what happens? The 4 tefachim, so 8 divided by 2 is 4, but the mat itself has a certain amount of width of its own, and therefore there's basically it no longer is Rosh Hashanah because neither of these two sides have 4 tefachim of their own. Okay, and therefore you're exempt in that case because the place where it lands is no longer a private domain, and therefore you're a pater. La Abaye, now the Gemara points out, Abaye was the one who just said the statement. Now, with the fact that Abaye says that a person is pater there, what is that? That goes back to our discussion yesterday. Yesterday we had this whole discussion about something, a transfer that takes place simultaneous with the creation of a domain or the negation of a domain, right? At the same time the domain was created or negated, there is a transfer of an item. So Abaye says very clearly, he says, I don't have any questions. When I put a mat, which is an object, and I'm transferring the object from the public domain into what was a moment ago private domain, but at the same time it falls, it no longer is a private domain, right? At the same exact moment, I'm exempt. So to him, it's obvious that the machzeles, this mat, nullifies the private domain and makes it into something else, right? Makes it into no longer a private domain at the same exact time that it lands. So kol sheken chulyad mevat lemechitza. For Abaye, certainly a clump of earth would certainly nullify a partition, right? A clump of earth is much more connected to the ground itself, and therefore if it would be a clump of earth that's falling and negating the 10 tefachim, making a 9 tefachim, then certainly he would say, I just see it as one, and it would certainly be a case where it's able to impact the space that is being thrown into on contact. The Rabbi Yochanan, but Rabbi Yochanan, who we discussed yesterday, who was uncertain about a clump of earth, does it become one with the earth immediately, or do we see it first as a transfer and then attaching to the earth? So he was questioning this about a clump of earth. So for him, for sure, he is for sure a mat, which is not really something which is at one with the rest of the earth. For him, certainly a mat would not become something that would impact the space. To him, it was only a question about the clump of earth, right? So again, just to review, we had a whole discussion yesterday about a situation. Let's say the one example was you had 10 tefachim deep, so it's Rosh Hashanah, and you take a clump of earth and you throw it into the Rosh Hashanah, and then as it lands, it also becomes one with the earth, right? So there's a question: did it land into Rosh Hashanah? Or do we see it as, because when it landed, it made the pit now 9 tefachim, it's no longer Rosh Hashanah. So Rabbi Yochanan wasn't sure. Abaye is sure about that. Abaye says, no, if I throw something in, the moment it lands, it transforms the domain, and therefore I am not going to be liable in that case, because now it's no longer Rosh Hashanah. But he's talking about a mat. A mat is something which is obviously a very different material than earth, and he's confident about the mat, so for sure he's going to be confident about the clump of earth, whereas Rabbi Yochanan was questioning about a clump of earth, so for him a partition is definitely not, a mat is definitely not going to impact the space on contact, because according to him, he wasn't even sure about a clump of earth, which is much more, one with the land. Okay. Vamar Abaye, Barbashus Ram Muka Sar Chava Arba, we're at 100A2. Vamar Abaye, Barbashus Ram Muka Sar Chava Arba Malea Mayim. Let's say you have a pit which is 10 deep, 4 tefachim wide, and it's filled with water. V'zark l'soch, and a person throws something into it. Chayiv, you're going to be chayiv. Now, even though it's filled with water, you're going to be chayiv. Okay. However, malea peros v'zark l'socha pater. If it's filled with fruit or any other produce, and a person throws an object into it, you're going to be pater. Why? My taima mayim lo mevat lemichitzasa, peros mevat lemichitzasa, because water nullifies, where it does not nullify. Whereas fruits do nullify. The way the Rishonim explain this is that if I have a pit which is 10 tefachim deep and 4 wide, that is a reshus hayachid. If I'm throwing something into it, the water ultimately is going to sink to the bottom of the water. So if I were to say, is this pit filled with water a domain onto itself? The answer is yes, because I could store things in this water. I could take my whatever objects I want to store, put it into that water, and it's going to fall to the bottom, and it'll encompass it. Whereas if I have a pit filled with fruit and I put something on top, it's just going to rest on the top. It's not really going to go. It's not going to go to the bottom, and therefore it's filled up. It's no longer seen as a pit, a proper pit. Okay, Tana Namihach of Brisa, which supports this. Hazorg min hayam le'israti amu min israt le'am pater. We're going to see this soon. A discussion about sea. Person throws an object from a sea to a highway, from a highway to a sea. A sea is typically, or ocean is typically seen as a carmelis. It's seen as a non-rishus rab, non-rishus yachid. However, if within this sea there is a pit, like a depression, right, of 10 tvachim by 4 tvachim, then you're going to be chayiv. You're going to be chayiv in such a case because that is, even though it's in the water, we treat that as a independent rishus hayachid. Okay, and so you see that something filled up with water does not negate the space, and we treat it as rishus yachid. Whereas if you have a pit which is filled with objects and a person throws something into it, then you are going to be pater in that case because it's not considered a domain onto its own. Okay, new Mishnah. Hazorik arba amos bekosel. A person throws an object 4 amos in the public domain against a wall. Lemala me'asar tefachim. If it's above 10 tefachim, kizork ba'avir. You're throwing something in the air. You're completely exempt, right? So we've had this principle a number of times that in the public domain ends at 10 tefachim. And therefore, if a person throws an object against a wall and it's above 10 tefachim, it's like the object you threw is suspended in the air. Lamata mi'asar, if it's lower than 10 tefachim, kizork ba'aretz, it's as if you threw it on the ground. And azork ba'aretz arba amos chayv, and a person who throws an object 4 amos onto the ground is liable. So therefore, just like if I throw an object from here to 4 amos away, I'm going to be chayv. Similarly, if I throw an object against a wall 4 amos away, I'm going to be chayv as well. Ask the Gemara, v'halonach, when I throw it 4 amos away, this object, why are you saying that when I throw it against a wall and it's under 10 tefachim, I'm going to be chayiv? It never landed, never rested anywhere. So Amrav Yochanan, we actually saw this quoted earlier, yesterday, Bidvela Shemena Shanina, we're talking about a case of a sticky fig cake, and therefore it's actually sticking to the wall, and therefore it does rest, right? We spoke about this idea that in order to be chayiv for transferring an object, the object has to be at rest, it has to stop. And therefore we're talking about a sticky fig cake, and I throw it against the wall, and it stops against the wall, and therefore it is at rest. And therefore, that's how we answer the question of the fact that it does actually rest because it's a sticky cake, a sticky fig cake, and therefore it's sticking to the wall. Okay, Amrav Yudah Marav Amrav Chia Zark Lamala Me'asar V'Halcha V'Nacha B'Chor Kolshu. If a person throws an object from the public domain above 10 tefachim and it lands in a small crevice in the wall. Okay, so we're talking about a wall which the crevice itself is very small, but the wall itself is 4 tefachim. Okay, so basically you have a case where you're throwing something against a wall. You're not throwing it 4 tefachim. You're standing a foot away, and I throw like a little, some small object, above 10 tefachim. Okay, and it lands in a small crevice. The wall itself is 4 tefachim. Okay, but it lands in a small crevice which doesn't have 4 tefachim in it. So banam lachokas Rameir b'Rabbanan. This comes to a dispute between Rameir and the Rabbanan. The Rameir damar chokin lahashlim. Rameir holds this idea that we carve to complete, and therefore mechayiv, you would hold your liable. I'll explain what this means in a moment. La Rabbanan damri ein chokin lahashlim lo mechayiv. According to the Rabbanan, they hold we do not carve to complete, and therefore they do not make you liable. What are we talking about? What does this mean? Carve to complete. So this is actually comes up a lot in Hilchos Mezuzah. If you look at the diagram, the picture in footnote 26, you see there's an arch. Okay, so you see this arch, and this arch is, in order to be chayiv for mezuzah, you have to have a proper doorway. What's a proper doorway? 4 tefachim by 10 tefachim. But let's say you have an arch which juts into it's not proper 4 tefachim across all the way to the top, because as it gets higher, it starts to be arched, right? So you have an arched doorway. So in this case, the Rabbanan say, you're not going to be chayiv for mezuzah, because in order to be a proper doorway, you need it to be 4 all the way up, and 10, all the way up to 10 tefachim. Whereas Rameir says, since in the wall you could theoretically cut through it. In other words, even though it's not cut through, but you could imagine that it could be cut through. Chokin lahashla means we see it, since it's possible to cut through it, we therefore see it as if it's cut through. So Rameir would hold in this diagram, in this picture you see below, you would be chayiv for mezuzah, and the Rabbanan say you're not chayiv for mezuzah. Just parenthetically, because again, many of people do have arched doorways. If the arch begins beyond 4 by 10, which is your typical thing. Again, 10 tefachim is like where that red line is, right? So it's not even so high, and 4 tefachim, right, is not very far wide. So your typical doorway, even your arched doorway, is going to be larger than 4 by 10. The arch is going to begin above it, and therefore your typical doorway in any of our homes, you're going to have a mezuzah on it, even though it's arched, because the arch begins, it starts curving in after you already have the requisite space of 4 by 10. But here we're talking about a very small doorway of 4 by 10. So Rameir holds you, imagine that space you see the gray space. You imagine it as if they dug it out to complete the halachic space. Whereas the Rabbanan say you don't do that. So similarly over here, I throw this small little thing. It falls into a crevice. So the crevice is small. The Rabbanan say, well, the crevice is not a Rishus HaYachid because it lands on a place which is tiny. But Rameir says, no, but since the wall itself has the space for 4 tefachim, we treat it as if I dug through all across 4 tefachim, and therefore it's a full-fledged Rishus HaYachid, and therefore I'm going to be chayiv in that case. Okay? Tananami hachi, we have a brisa which supports this. Zark l'malam and sarva halach b'nacha b'char kol shehu. If a person throws an object from the public domain above 10 tefachim and it lands in a small crevice, Rameir mechayiv, Rameir holds you liable again because you imagine, you as if you dig through across that crevice all the way through, and therefore you have a space of 4 tefachim. The Chacham and Pochim, the Chacham say no, we don't do this imagining and digging through, and therefore they exempt the person. Okay, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav. A mound that gradually accumulates a height of 10 tefachim within a span of 4 amos. V'zarak v'nachal gabav, when a person throws an object in the public domain and lands upon this mound, chayiv, you're going to be chayiv. So what's happening over here? I'm in the public domain and I have a pile of dirt. Now, if the pile of dirt is a small pile of dirt, or it's at an incline that is a very narrow incline, right? So, when one day we're going to have hopefully a ramp to our aron in our shul, God willing, and so people who are in a wheelchair, whatever, and a walker, could get up there. I think it'd be beautiful, right? So it'd be great. Now, to code, it's extremely broad. The incline is a very not steep.
Quite narrow.
Narrow? No. Is that the opposite of steep?
Low grade.
I don't know, whatever it is. But basically, there's a code, right? There's a code that it's very, very, it's very, very gradual, the incline, because you want to make it easy to climb up. If, this would never pass by code, right? If it's like this, that wouldn't work, right? You can't be schlepping the wheelchair up, that wouldn't work. So if it's a steep incline, then it's considered like a domain onto itself. And therefore, the measurement for a steep incline, once it's a steep incline, if it's a very low-grade incline, then we see it just as continuous with the public domain. If it's a very steep incline, then we see it as its own separate domain. And therefore, what we're saying over here is if the incline of 4 amos takes place within a span, if it gets to 10 tefachim, within a span of 4 amos, that's so steep that we see it as a domain unto its own. Okay? And if it's a domain unto its own, now we have a Rishus HaYachid. If the incline is more gradual, then we would see it as just a continuation of the private domain. And that's what we're saying over here. So, Tel Mislaket Asar Mitoch Arba, if it gradually accumulates to 10 tefachim within a span of 4 amos, that's very steep. V'zark v'nachal gabav, and somebody throws something from the public domain onto this mound, you're going to be chayiv. Why? Because it's a full-fledged private domain. If the incline is more gradual, then it's a continuation of the public domain, and you will not be chayiv. Tananami hachi, we have a brisa which supports this mavoi. A mavoi, what's a mavoi? A mavoi is, and this is, God willing, we'll get to Erevin and we'll all stick it out, and it gets easier after Erevin, so just stick it out. But basically, a mavoi is if you think of like Pickwick, where they have these, these, what do they call it? Like a cul-de-sac of sorts, where you have like a bunch of houses within like a squared area, and basically, and you would go off the road onto these into these like neighborhoods that you have the main road, and then you have these the mavoi is basically this like shared space in between, and then you have the houses all surrounding it. That's a mavoi. Now, you typically would need to have a lechi, some form of a reminder that the mavoi is a private area, because it is continuous into the public domain, and therefore there's a concern a person is going to carry it and carry out of the mavoi into the public domain, even though this is a quasi-private domain. So in order to prevent a person from doing so, you have like a certain stick, you have some reminder at the edge of the mavoi telling people not to go. However, if it's really distinct from the private domain, from the public domain, through this incline, then you don't need that stick. So that's what it says over here. So mavoi sheshav lesocho v'nasa midron l'shus harabah. Mavoi that is flush, it's level along its inside, but then slopes downwards towards the public domain. Or it's level from the public domain, but then it slopes downward towards its inside. In other words, you have one of these steep inclines. Also mavoi and this mavoi does not need the lechi kor, the stick that reminds people that it's a separate domain. You don't need it because it's such a distinct domain. Okay, let's turn the page. Okay, so similar teaching that a mound that gradually accumulates to a height of 10 tefachim within a span of 4 amos, and someone throws on it, then you're chayav because it's a full-fledged private domain because of the steep incline. Okay, new Mishnah, zark l'soch arba amos, a person who throws something within 4 amos, but it rolls beyond 4 amos, pater. So right, so it lands and then it rolls. You're going to be pater. Chutz arba amos. Right? In other words, I intended to throw something within 4 amos. It lands within 4 amos, and then it rolls outside of 4 amos. I'm going to be pater. Chutz arba amos. If I threw an object and it went beyond 4 amos, and then it rolled back within 4 amos, I'm going to be chayiv. Now, we're not only talking about a case where it seems like from the Mishnah, the simple, although it says v'niskalgal, which seems to be it's rolling, the Mishnah understands we're talking about a case with a very strong wind. So I throw something. Okay, and it's kind of like stationary a little bit within 4 amos, which I would not be high for, and then the wind blows it further, I'm going to be pater. If I throw it beyond 4 amos and it's still airborne, it kind of like is stationary, like if it was strong winds, like it stands and then it goes back in, I'm going to be chayiv in that case. Okay, ask the Gemara v'halonach, how could I be chayiv in the case where I throw it outside of 4 amos? How could I be chayiv? It never came to rest. Rav Yochanan v'hushanach al gabe mashehu. It rested briefly on a small thing. Of a small, like let's say, rest on a small something for just a moment. Okay, Tani nami hachi zark chutz la'arba amos. If a person's throwing something beyond 4 amos, and the wind pushed it back to within 4 amos, v'afal pisha chazar votziato, and even though the wind brought it back in, pater. Okay, I'm going to be pater. Achazat ruach mashehu, but if it was held by an object, even though it then came back within 4 amos, I'm going to be chayiv. So clearly, our Mishnah is talking about a case where although it says that it sounds like it's just airborne, it's not actually airborne. It rests on something. Imagine like a what do they call, like a state, like the thing that you hold like a golf ball. What's that called? T. Oh my gosh, I'm like not doing English today. Okay, so yeah. So basically imagine it lands on like a T just for a split second, and then it goes back into the 4 amos. Then I'm still going to be chayiv, even though it rests on that small little thing. It's not so sturdy. It rests on that, that's when I'm going to be chayiv. But if it's just airborne, I'm actually going to be pater because we look where it really lands. So what Rav Yochanan and really is explaining our Mishnah is talking about a case where it's completely airborne. If it's completely airborne, I would not be chayiv. It has to be a case where it landed for a split second on something outside of 4 amos. Boom, I'm chayiv, even though it like wasn't fully stationary, it rolls back in, it kind of flies back in, I'm going to be chayiv in that case. Amar Rava, says Rava, Tok shloshel rabbanan tzarech hanach lagame mashehu. Okay, so Rava over here is not talking about our Mishnah. Rava is talking about, if you recall, we had this machlokas between Rabbi Kiva and the Rabbanan about throwing something through a private domain, or through a public domain. Rabbi Kiva said that kluta, if it's stuck in the airspace, kimisha huncha, it's as if it landed on the ground. Okay, and the Rabbanan disagree. But the Rabbanan, now Rav is coming along and saying that the Rabbanan, even when something was within 3 tfachim from the ground, which we until now have said, if it's so close to the ground, many treat it as if it's on the ground. Even there, the Rabbanan are going to hold, it has to fall on a minute something. It just simply being close to the ground is not enough to see it as if it's on the ground. You would still need it to fall on something minute in order for you to be chayiv. Okay, Yasim Remer v'Kamar la hashmaita. Remer is saying saying this over. Amalei Ravina Remer. Ravina turns to Remer and he says, let's turn the page to Kuf Amud Beis. Lav Hainamas Nisan. Is this not in our Mishnah? How does he learn this from Mishnah? Because Rav Yochanan says about our Mishnah, again, what happened in our Mishnah? We asked in our Mishnah, why are you going to be chayiv when it goes beyond 4 amos if it ends up coming back within 4 amos? And Rav Yochanan says, it landed on something small. Why didn't Rav Yochanan have a better answer? You know why you're chayiv when it goes beyond 4 amos and it comes back? Because it was within 3 tvachim. And if it's within 3 tvachim, the Rabbanan would hold it as if it's on the ground. The fact that he did not answer that implies that it actually has to land on something. So, and therefore, we can learn it from our Mishnah. Why does Rava have to come along and say it? So, Amar Lei, Amar says to Ravina, no, you can't learn it from a Mishnah. Misgalgal ka'amras, you're going to learn it from a case of rolling. When it's moving, it's swirling around by the wind, they're different. Misgalgal in sof laniach. When it's swirling around, meaning it's something which is being blown by the wind, it's not, we don't see it in any way as if it's resting. And therefore, even within 3 tfachim, we need it to fall on something. Aval hai, in the case of Rava, came with a sofa lanuach. We're talking about something which is just flying in the air regularly. Afagav delonach kemantanach dami. You may have said that therefore when it's just flying regularly and it's within 3 tfachim, you may have thought that it's as if it came to rest, and the Rabbanan will hold within 3 tfachim and you be chayav. Kamash malan, he's saying no, that even there, in a case where it's not being swirled around by the wind, you would think that you are going to be. It would not be coming. It would not, when it's within 3 tvachim, when it's not being swirled around by the wind, you would think that it's as if it's resting. Kamash malan, the Rabbanan say even there, Rava comes along and says even there, it actually has to be landing on a piece of something in order to be chayav. Okay, we're going to stop over here, and we probably don't have time for a minute. Have a good day. Have a good day. Meaningful day. Okay, take care, everyone.